All eyes now on the United States ahead of the United Nations Security Council vote for an end to the war between Israel and Hamas. The 15 members of the United Security Council are hoping to find language around which they can relate and conclude, or perhaps reaching an agreement. All say the want is the fighting in Gaza to end, but there are disagreements about the conditions under which it will be. We have more in this report.
The United Nations Security Council is to vote on a halt on the fighting in Gaza after it was delayed by a day amid ongoing negotiations to stave off another United States veto, and as Israel faces growing international pressure to change its tactics in the war against Hamas. An initial draft text of the new resolution seen on Monday called for an urgent and lasting cessation of hostilities to allow unimpeded access of humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. According to diplomatic sources, this language has now been watered down to an urgent suspension of hostilities and could be further weakened to satisfy Washington and get closer to a compromise. Last week, the 193-member UN General Assembly overwhelmingly approved a similar resolution. Ongoing resolutions are, however, non-binding. A key issue for the UN Security Council is how to implement and sustain a desperately needed aid operation. Human Rights Watch accused Israel on Monday of deliberately starving Gaza's population by blocking the delivery of food, water and fuel, a method of warfare that it described as a war crime. The draft resolution recognizes that civilians in Gaza do not have access to sufficient food, water, sanitation, electricity, telecommunications and medical services essential for their survival. It demands the parties to the conflict, Hamas and Israel, fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law and enable the immediate, safe and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance directly to the Palestinian civilian population throughout the Gaza Strip. In the meantime, Hamas officials say at least 20 people have been killed in the southern Gazan city of Rafah after overnight strikes. Without specifically commenting on the reported incident, the Israeli army says it targeted and killed a Hamas financier in Rafah. Last night, 3 elderly Israeli men who were taken hostage were shown in a new video by the armed wing of Hamas, the Al-Qassam Brigade. The video shows Chaim Perry, 79, Yoram Megza, 80, and Amiram Cooper, 85. The footage was released on the Telegram messaging app. The hostages taken in October are believed to be held by Hamas and allied Palestinian groups. About 120 hostages are believed to still be in captivity in Gaza after a deadly Hamas attack on the 7th of October. Israel's military described the footage as a criminal terror video and despicable.
Let's now speak with international law expert Livingston Wechi, who joins me live from Abuja. Thanks for joining the world now. Diplomatic sources are saying we're probably going to see a draft text away from saying an urgent and lasting cessation of hostilities to urgent suspension of hostilities. Do you think it would matter how the words are framed to have the Security Council agree without a U.S. opposition?
Well, thanks for having me. We can see that in the international plane, language matters a lot. Nelson Mandela says if you speak to a man in a language you understand, it goes to his head. But if you speak to him in his own language, it goes to his heart. As it were, the limit of my language is the limit to which I have to my world. And it's important to note that until languages are unambiguous on negotiation tables, it becomes difficult to implement certain agreements. You know, the diplomatic space is a very, very delicate and sensitive space that if you are not clear in the terminologies, which has become a great issue at this time, you may end up signing up to the unforeseeable. So as it were, I see that the two contentious issues here has to do with one, language, the issue with respect to either cessation of hostilities or suspension of hostilities. And these are two different paradigms. So it's important that those terms be properly defined so that parties affected do not end up plunging the entire situation into a catastrophe. There's a lot already ongoing, and it's important to state that Israel it appears disposed to defending its territory at all costs, because there is a mindset within this war that is ongoing between Hamas and Israel. Remember, we are not dealing with two sovereigns here. We are dealing with Israel, which is a sovereign, and then Hamas, which is classified by the West as a terrorist organization. And I want to say clearly that the idea of the United Nations calling for either suspension or cessation of hostilities with respect to international humanitarian law is highly welcomed, because every day we wake up to the news of innocent lives being lost on account of this war between Hamas and Israel, because Hamas has intertwined itself within the civilian population, making this very conflict very difficult to determine with respect to the type of casualties to expect. So language is crucial, and I believe it's negotiable between the U.S., which is a permanent member nation in the United Nations Security Council. And the worry of the United Arab Emirates is that if America ends up vetoing the resolutions, then the entire resolution collapses. Because only 5 permanent members, Russia, America, United Kingdom, France, and China, have those veto powers, which it vested in itself upon the formation of the United Nations.
That's right, Mr.
That gives it special powers to either cancel or as it were, go against certain resolutions, particularly knowing that each permanent member having those powers, exercise them both for their own interest as well as the interest of their allies, particularly those within the global south. So it's important that issue of language is clearly
if you can
clarified.
Hear me, Mr. Wechi, what happens after, let's assume that they are able to vote for a ceasefire? Do you think the U.S. is on the same page with Israel as to a two-state solution, bearing in mind the latest speech by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who seems to have thrown that idea out of the window?
Well, I said earlier that Israel has a mindset. I have seen, we've listened to several narratives and rhetoric from the Israeli government that whether or not any nation stands by them, they are going ahead with this war. Because Israel is the only single Jewish state on earth today, and there are certain calculations and some running narratives that the Arab world has made up its mind to decimate Israel from the face of the earth. And that is being executed by the very ambitious terrorist organizations. Now, it's important to note that America appears to be resolute in their support for Israel, even though within the American government there are divisions and divided opinions, as it were, particularly the view that America appears to be misunderstanding the disillusionment within the global South with respect to the type of positions it has taken in calling out Russia for war crimes, but failing to call out Israel for war crimes over the multiplicity or the multitude of killings that have taken place during this war. These are narratives. And remember also, Israel is also dealing with a gang up of the Western media, which appears to be blackmailing Israel's efforts in defending itself and putting Israel on its toes. So Israel has put all these items on the table. It knows that the Western media is playing out a script, which is its view, that the Western media is playing out that script. So America has a special interest that appears undying with the nation of Israel, which appears to be giving some advantages to Israel in negotiating their freedom and their defense. So it is up to the United Nations, because one of the worries and the global concerns by certain watchers is the fact that whereas the United Nations Security Council and the UN itself is pushing for a ceasefire for humanitarian purposes, they have not strongly considered the need to reach a resolution over the actions of Hamas in attacking Israel, or Hamas itself as a body reaching a resolution, as well as coming up with compelling grounds upon which the Middle East or the Arab world should stand with them to call Hamas to order or to decimate them as well. Because there is no justification for the perceived romance between Hamas and the Arab world, as well as the United Nations on one point, which is why Israel appears to be having a continuous standoff with the United Nations positions concerning this war.
It's hard to tell whether sustaining the war in Gaza will decimate or, completely destroy Hamas structure or even strengthen it the more. But let's see how the Security Council vote in the coming hours. Livingston Wechi, live for us in our Abuja studio. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.